some of you know, I've told you, I've been going swimming in the lake. Some of you have done that as well. There's a little house right next to the lake. I don't know what the house is. What is this house next to the lake? Is it the boat house? Okay. So if you look on the right-hand side of this house, you'll see some names scribbled in it. Did you see that? Did you see that? Check it out when you go there. Their names scribbled. There's a certain Eki and Svana who scribbled their names in 1927 into the board of the house. And I was looking at it today. I thought, here are some Eki and Svana, or is it Sven or Svan? I'm not sure. Doing something there 95 years ago, writing their names. What would they, they presumably were old enough to remember the First World War. They did not have any idea that 12 years later, there would be a completely traumatic, tragic war that would shake Europe. They did not know that, they did not know what would happen 100 years hence. And if they saw us today, what would they ask? What would they ask us? Or what would we ask them? It's very interesting when you take the long view. Every generation thinks that theirs is an absolutely unique generation in the sense that they're witnessing this unheard of changes. And ours is also, we're not an exception. We think we'll live in this epochal changing age, something completely new, unprecedented, unseen before. Remember 2 years ago when the pandemic started, everybody was saying, oh, this is such a game changer. The world will never be the same again. Completely different. Everything is so completely different. And here we are 2 years later, and nobody's really talking about it anymore. And I do not see a single mask in this room, and I'm not wearing one, although I have one in my bag. Very foul-smelling old mask that I still carry around. But if I try to put it on, some of you will think I'm crazy, and I will think myself that I'm crazy. So all of that is just merely to say that things change, and we think that they're dramatic, but in retrospect, they appear to be less dramatic than we thought. The war in Ukraine is extremely tragic. Islam as a Russian with Ukrainian connections, but also, I see myself more as an Anglo-Russian at this point. I could not, for the first week of the war was absolutely just traumatic for me. I thought I was not going to survive it. It's like psychologically extremely, extremely difficult. Your ostensible country is invading another country, killing people. That's just how do you explain to yourself? For the first week, I could not even get out of bed. I was just depressed. And a week later, I bounced back, and here I am talking about it 2 months, 3 months later. Seems I'm still alive. People are resilient like this. People are resilient. Who knows what we'll be talking about 2 years from now? If we're lucky enough, we'll not have a nuclear war, if we're not stupid enough to do it. 2 years from now, what will be happening? Hard to say. 20 years from now, how will we look back on this war? Will it be something big in our minds, or just, as Frank noted the other day, footnote to footnote? It's hard to say. I'm frequently asked to comment on Putin's policy. I think that's because people think that as a Russian, I have some kind of insights into Putin's brain. People will turn to me and say, well, can you explain what is happening here? You have the required cultural background. I mean, you have read Dostoevsky. Do you understand the mysterious Russian soul? How do you explain that? And my answer to this is, I don't know. I don't know how to explain any of this. I have to say, I find Putin's interest in history extremely amusing. There was a moment in December 2019. I'm a historian, by the way. There was a moment in 2019 which every historian would look at it and think, this is very strange. But Putin had a meeting with the Commonwealth of Independent States leaders, various leaders of those former Soviet republics that quasi-defer to Russia. And to the meeting, he brought a stack of archival documents. Whoever does that? Can we think of any other leader who goes to summit and brings archival documents? This is weird. I mean, Will does that because he's also a historian. He's like, oh, look at the archival documents. I get really excited about archival documents, but if I were the leader of a country, I would not bring them to summit. This is very strange. And that is why. No other, if you look historically, no other Russian Soviet ruler has ever done anything like that. It's very strange. And I think that's why it has been so difficult for me and for many other observers to understand and accept Putin the way he is. It was much easier for me to deny the obvious than to accept that a Russian president can do something like invading Ukraine, that so obviously runs counter to Russia's long-term strategic interests, and that makes Russia poor and more isolated. Never made any sense. The invasion of Ukraine was not the first time that I refused to believe something that was put right in front of my nose. So if you remember apartment bombings back when Putin first came to power, there was this conspiracy theory that those were organized by the FSB, and the vast majority of reasonable people say, no, that's ridiculous. Why would the FSB do that? I mean, come on. Surely there's some kind of conspiracy theory like QAnon. No, we no longer can say that with any certainty, because you look back, you think, wow, that's an interesting pattern. Think about Alexander Litvinenko and when he was poisoned with polonium in London. At that time, I thought, well, surely a Russian leader would not have organized something like that. That just seems so bizarre. And then we had Skripal's attempted assassination. Then we had Navalny's poisoning. And it just, you look at the evidence, and you just ask why. None of this ever made any sense. That's why, by the way, I was and I remain quite against the sort of generalizations that you occasionally hear from politicians in Eastern Europe specifically. This is what the Russians do. This is who the Russians are. To this sort of statements, I usually respond, what the hell are you talking about? This is not what you do. This is not who you are. And they would say to me, well, you're not a real Russian. You've been out of Russia for too long, so you don't understand these things. The real Russians, this is what they do, and this is who they are. But I can tell you, before the invasion of Ukraine, I was in Moscow literally days before the invasion. I was talking to the Moscow blob, the kind of policy community, people who work for the foreign ministry and various think tanks, etc. Nobody saw it coming, and for the same reason, they thought it was insane. They thought it was insane. It doesn't mean that they're also not Russians or they don't understand Russia. Be as it may, we are in a situation where Russia is waging a brutal war, a war of conquest, and we cannot afford any longer to make any excuses for Putin. At this point, the reasonable thing to do is to accept him for what he is and to take him at his word. And that is to say, he's trying to rebuild some kind of a Russian empire, obviously conquer Ukraine if he can, and perhaps maybe conquer the Baltics, although probably he doesn't have the capacity to do so, the capability. Again, we have to be a little bit cautious here and not confuse the absence of evidence of potential Russian aggression for the evidence of absence. The same logic applies to Sweden and Finland. Given the history of lies and deceptions from the Kremlin, we cannot afford not taking Putin as his word, but we also have to understand that Russia does not have the capabilities to match its ambitions. Russia has shown itself to be something of a paper tiger. If it cannot even defeat Ukraine, what are the odds that it can win a war against NATO that has considerable greater firepower and manpower than anything Putin can demonstrate? So maintaining a degree of skepticism about Putin's threat to Europe and to the world is still a reasonable thing to do. So I don't think we're fighting World War III quite yet. I remain skeptical, but we do not. That's not because we understate Putin's, I understate Putin's ambitions. It's just I do not believe that he has the capabilities to match. Anyway, so after the initial shock, and I'll make just very few brief points here. After the initial shock of the Russian invasion has worn off, and now we face the likelihood of a long-term war in Ukraine, we might also ask ourselves questions about the future, not what might happen a week or two from now. Sometimes this is the tendency. I mean, we don't, and this is why I title my talk "A Long Game with Russia." We talk about short term. We talk about what might happen a week from now, or a month from now, or 3 months from now. But what will happen 95 years from now? We don't know. Of course we don't know. But even, just a few years into the future, we don't even ask those questions. Sometimes we have these fantasies that float out there. So a lot of people talk about, well, how about let's break up Russia? I mean, first of all, I think this is probably unrealistic. Secondly, I think it would be probably extremely dangerous to do that. Remember that Russia has nuclear weapons. And this is, by the way, something that President George H.W. Bush was really worried about when the Soviet Union was falling apart. He thought this is actually crazy. This is dangerous because you could have civil war in a country full of nuclear weapons. And I think this is a concern that we should continue to have. People had very unrealistic expectations about a potential coup in Moscow, that somehow Putin would be overthrown. I was very skeptical of this, not because I see into the future. I don't, but because I know the past, and Russian history shows us that the Russians are actually quite passive. The population would not actually rise up against a dictator in the way that we expected or hoped it would, and also the odds of a coup. It has happened in Russian history. It has happened, but very, very rarely. The one that I can point your attention to in the last 100 years is Khrushchev's overthrow in October 1964 by his comrades. But this is rare. So we can hope for it, but we cannot make our policy on this basis. I think that's the reasonable thing to say. Alina rightly talked yesterday about how it is important for the Russians themselves to understand the kind of follies that they have committed, and to reappraise what they are, to find a role for themselves. This is easier said than done, and the parallels with Japan and Germany are not fully convincing. That is because Germany and Japan were completely defeated in the Second World War. So imagine if Germany was not defeated, but was just pushed back to the borders of Old Reich, and would sort of expect them to recognize the fall of Hitlerism, and would they do that? I don't know. Same with Japan. If Japan did not fully capitulate, it was just pushed back, even from the mainland of Asia. Would they have complete recognition of their past mistakes? I don't know if that they would. I mean, I don't know actually that they have, even the way things have turned out for them. So very quickly, just 2 minutes to go. I've got some short-term issues and long-term issues that I will highlight for you. So short-term, I would agree that the key point here is the continued arms supplies to Ukraine. That is very obvious. We need to continue helping Ukraine. A question was raised yesterday about the end game, whether we should talk about the end game or not. My general take on this is when we talk about Putin's defeat, we do not know what we're talking about specifically. And there's this whole argument about some off-ramps and end games. We don't have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. So does Putin's defeat mean that Russia would have to be pushed out from Crimea and DNR and LNR? Is that what we mean by Putin's defeat? Does it mean that Putin would have to be pushed back, or the Russians would have to be pushed back to the lines of February 23? Is that defeat of Russia? Because we have this vagueness in our discourse. We keep arguing, but we don't know what we're arguing about. And actually, I would argue that we should have a clear understanding of what potential scenarios would look like. I don't know if that means talking about the end game or just having a clear understanding. Deterrent in the meantime, of course, we have to build up deterrence in Northern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. That's only reasonable. Increase European energy autonomy. By the way, energy autonomy will also help Russia a great deal, because nothing undermines Russia more than having this inflow of cash from oil and gas. This is what is used to sustain Putin's criminal regime and avoid reforms. Right. Then we have another thing that I think is very, very important, even for the short term, is we have to focus still on the avoidance of nuclear war. We have people talking about how it's not likely and it's not going to happen, etc. The bottom line is we don't know. We don't know whether it's likely or not likely. We just do not know how this kind of ideas play out. In the long term, and this is the long-term game, and I know I'll have 30 seconds to talk about it. This was all, by the way, just an introduction to my big messaging here. the long term, we have to change the narrative. Today in Russia, we have this narrative that I think is partly supported by what is happening in the West, and that is that the West is trying to destroy Russia. I know this is Russian propaganda, and Putin is building, and Putin is trying to present that to the people and say, hey, look, they're trying to destroy us, therefore we have to come together in order to oppose this horrible threat from the West. I think it's all about, part of it is about messaging. We cannot change Russian mentality, but we can try to change the messaging so that it becomes more difficult for the Kremlin's propaganda to exploit or to rally the people. And that includes things like, messaging to the Russians that we do not seek to break Russia into small pieces. We do not seek Russia's demise. We're not out here to cancel Russia. I think the whole thing about canceling Russia is absurd. It's absolutely preposterous. And I would even say that in the long term, Russians always feel like they're being pushed out of Europe. In the long term, it's actually in NATO's interest to say we are open doors even for Russia. That doesn't mean that Russia will join NATO. It's all about messaging. It's all about messaging, saying, yes, we are not trying to push you out. If you qualify, you can join. Of course, they never will, but still, it's about the messaging. Finally, and this is the last point, I'm really worried that we are in a situation where we're shutting down contacts. And you know what matters here? It's the young people who matter. We should try to maintain contact. We should not try to shut them out. I was really perplexed 2 days ago when Putin had this conversation with young entrepreneurs. Did you see that? These young entrepreneurs were talking about startups and Googling something and doing this and doing that. And Putin is, okay, I will give orders to the Ministry of Economy. I mean, he's totally he does not understand what's happening. But we should reach out to those young people, make it easier for young Russians to come to Europe, to experience Europe, for young professionals to actually leave Russia, because this would undermine Russia in the long term if all the young professionals ran away, etc. Make contact easier. Do not shut them in that box, because if they're shut in that box, then they will just imagine that they are fighting for their survival against some kind of unspecified Western
Sergey,
threat.
thank you.
That's it.
Sergey, I have one question for you.
Yes.
What could come after Putin? A Putin the second, a Gorbachev, or a Yeltsin?
What will happen after Putin?
If there is an after Putin.
That is a very interesting question, because at the moment we do not have a strategy of how to. Okay, we cannot win or lose Russia. Yeah, Russia is for the Russians to figure out how to work it out. But what we should be mindful of course, we cannot get anywhere with Putin. Putin is hopeless. Yeah, we're done with Putin. We have to wait until he drops dead or something, or maybe he's overthrown. But when he's replaced by somebody else, there's this assumption that we just have to have a 0 or 100%. Either the Russians make all the concessions or not. We have to create an incentive structure for the Russians to walk away from to pull out of Ukraine, to walk away from some of the crimes and follies that they have committed. And that is going to be a difficult process. I expect that if Putin drops dead, though, we'll have a small power struggle like we had after Stalin's death in 1953. This will create a window of opportunity for the West to engage with Russia, but there has to be a system of incentives, and not, we should not expect that we just say to the new Russian leadership, just capitulate. And they will say, yeah, okay, we capitulate because we want to have sanctions removed. So there has to be a graduated system for sanction removal, et cetera, et cetera.
We have a panel discussion where we can discuss this more. Thank you very much for this thought.